A fist pounded on Alara Whitmore's door before the sun had even touched the sky. She sat up in bed, her heart racing, and reached for a shawl to cover her shoulders. The pounding came again, harder this time, and a man's voice called her name with an urgency that made her stomach twist. She opened the door to find Edmund Price, the palace steward, standing in the torchlight with 2 guards behind him. His face was pale, and his hands trembled slightly as he held out a folded paper sealed with the royal crest. "Alara Whitmore," he said, his voice tight. "You are to leave the palace grounds before dawn. Pack only what you can carry. You are not permitted to speak to anyone on your way out." Alara stared at him, certain she had misheard. She had served in the royal household for 3 years, first as a laundry girl and later as one of the Queen's personal seamstresses. She had never been late, never been careless, never given anyone cause to doubt her loyalty. "There must be a mistake," she said. "Please, let me speak to someone. Let me understand what I have done." Edmund would not meet her eyes. "There is no mistake. These are the Queen's own orders. I am sorry, Alara. I truly am. But I cannot say more." The words struck her like cold water. The Queen herself had ordered this. Alara had spent countless evenings in the Queen's private chambers, mending gowns, listening to her quiet worries about the kingdom, even sharing small jokes between stitches. She had believed, foolishly perhaps, that there was a bond of trust between them. She dressed quickly, her hands shaking as she fastened the buttons of her plain gray dress. She packed a small bag with her sewing kit, a few pieces of clothing, and a wooden comb her mother had given her before she passed. Everything else, the modest room she had called home, the friendships she had built among the kitchen staff, the quiet pride she had taken in her work, all of it would be left behind. As she stepped into the corridor, flanked by the silent guards, she glanced up toward the east wing of the palace, where the Queen's private chambers overlooked the courtyard. A single candle burned in the window, and for a brief moment, she saw a figure standing behind the glass. It was the Queen, wrapped in a dark shawl, watching the courtyard below. Alara opened her mouth to call out, to beg for an explanation, but one of the guards gripped her arm firmly and guided her forward. She looked back one more time. The Queen had not moved. Her expression, even from a distance, seemed heavy, with something Alara could not name. Sorrow, perhaps, or fear. They walked in silence through corridors Alara had once known so well, past the kitchens where she had shared warm bread with the cooks on cold mornings, past the sewing room where she had spent countless hours bent over silk and thread, learning every stitch until her fingers ached. Now those same halls felt foreign, as though she were a stranger being marched out of a place she had never truly belonged. At the servants' gate, the guards released her arm. Edmund stood a few steps away, holding a small pouch of coins that he pressed into her hand. "This is not much," he said quietly, "but it will help until you find your footing. I wish I could tell you more, Alara. Please believe that." "Why is this happening?" she asked, her voice breaking despite her effort to stay composed. "What did I do wrong?" Edmund glanced over his shoulder, as though checking whether anyone else could hear him. "You did nothing wrong," he whispered. "That much I can promise you. But there are things happening within these walls that are far beyond either of us. Go home, Alara. Keep your head low. And whatever you do, do not try to return." Before she could ask another question, he turned and walked back through the gate, leaving her standing alone in the cold morning air. The heavy iron gate creaked shut behind him, and the sound echoed through the empty street like a verdict being sealed. Alara stood there for a long moment, staring at the palace walls that rose high above her, their stone faces gray and indifferent in the dim light. She thought of all the mornings she had walked through that very gate with a light heart, eager to begin her work. Now she felt as though a part of her life had been torn away without warning, without reason, without mercy. She began walking, her small bag clutched tightly against her chest, her breath forming clouds in the chilly air. The village where she had grown up was nearly 2 hours away on foot, and she had no coin for a carriage beyond the small pouch Edmund had given her. She decided to save it for something more urgent and set off along the dirt road that wound through fields still touched by morning frost. As she walked, her mind raced through every possible explanation. Had she offended someone in the court without realizing it? Had she made a mistake in her sewing that damaged something valuable? Had someone spoken lies about her? She could not think of a single reason why the Queen, of all people, would order her removal so suddenly and so coldly. She remembered a conversation from just a few days earlier, when she had been mending a gown for the Queen, and noticed her mistress seemed unusually distracted. The Queen had asked her strange questions that day, questions about her family, her past, whether she had any enemies, whether anyone had approached her with unusual requests. At the time, Alara had thought little of it. assuming the queen was simply tired or troubled by matters of state. Now, looking back, she wondered if those questions had meant something more. She also recalled the way certain nobles had looked at her in recent weeks, their eyes lingering with something that felt like suspicion or resentment. Lady Beatrice Sinclair, in particular, had always treated her with a coolness that bordered on disdain, though Elara had never understood why. Perhaps, she thought, jealousy over her closeness to the queen had grown into something darker. The sun rose slowly as she walked, casting long shadows across the fields. Farmers were beginning their morning work, and a few gave her curious looks as she passed, her fine palace-made dress standing out against the simple homespun clothing of the countryside. She kept her eyes forward, unwilling to meet anyone's gaze, afraid that her humiliation was somehow visible on her face. By the time she reached the outskirts of her home village, her feet ached and her legs felt heavy with exhaustion. The small cottages and narrow lanes felt both familiar and strange, as though she had been gone far longer than the 3 years she had actually spent at the palace. She saw a few faces she recognized, old neighbors who paused in their work to watch her pass, their expressions shifting from surprise to open curiosity. She reached her old family home, now occupied by her aunt, and knocked on the door with a trembling hand. When her Aunt Margaret opened it, her face went through a rapid series of emotions: shock, concern, and finally a kind of wary confusion. "Elara, what are you doing here? Why are you not at the palace?" "I was sent away," Elara said simply, unable to find the strength for a longer explanation. "I do not know why." Her aunt studied her for a long moment, then stepped aside to let her in. "Come inside before the neighbors start talking. We will figure this out together." Inside the small, familiar kitchen, Elara sat by the fire and finally allowed herself to cry, the tears she had held back throughout the long walk finally spilling free. Her aunt made her a cup of warm tea and sat beside her, listening quietly as Elara recounted everything that had happened, from the pounding on her door to the final glimpse of the queen watching from her window. "There is something you are not being told," her aunt said finally, her brow furrowed in thought. "The queen does not dismiss her personal seamstress in the middle of the night without reason, especially not one she trusted as much as she trusted you. Someone wanted you gone, Elara, and they wanted it done quickly, before anyone could ask questions." Elara wiped her eyes and looked at her aunt, a small spark of determination beginning to replace her despair. "Then I need to find out who, and why." Her aunt reached over and squeezed her hand. "Be careful, child. Whatever is happening within those palace walls is bigger than either of us understands. For now, rest. Tomorrow we will think about what comes next." That night, as Elara lay in the small bed that had once been hers as a child, she stared up at the ceiling, unable to sleep. She thought again of the queen's face in the window, the sorrow in her eyes, the way she had watched Elara's departure without saying a single word. It did not feel like the expression of someone who wanted her gone. It felt like the expression of someone who had no other choice. Somewhere deep within her, a small flicker of hope began to grow. Perhaps this was not the end of her story at the palace. Perhaps, somehow, there was more to this sudden dismissal than cruelty or betrayal. But for now, all she could do was wait, and wonder, and try to piece together the fragments of a mystery that had upended her entire life in the span of a single dark morning. She thought back to the very first day she had entered the palace gates, 3 years earlier, a nervous girl of 18 carrying nothing but a small bundle of clothes and a letter of recommendation from the village priest. She remembered how overwhelming the palace had felt then, its endless corridors and towering ceilings, its servants moving briskly through halls that seemed to stretch on forever. She had worked hard to earn her place there, first scrubbing floors, then folding linens, until her careful stitching caught the attention of the head seamstress, who recommended her for training in finer needlework. It had been the queen herself who first noticed her talent. Stopping one afternoon to admire a delicate embroidery Elara had added to the hem of a court gown. From that day forward, she had been drawn more and more into the queen's personal service, until she was trusted with the most private and delicate garments in the royal wardrobe. She had never imagined, in all those years, that such trust could vanish in a single night. Lying awake now, she replayed every interaction she could remember from her final weeks at the palace, searching for any clue she might have missed. She remembered a hushed conversation she had overheard between 2 guards near the east corridor, something about strangers seen near the palace walls after dark. She remembered a letter that had gone missing from the queen's writing desk, one that had caused a quiet uproar among the senior staff for a single afternoon, before everyone was told to forget it had ever happened. At the time, none of it had seemed connected to her. Now, every small detail felt like it might hold a piece of the answer she so desperately needed. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters of her aunt's small cottage, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked into the darkness. Ilara pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and closed her eyes, though sleep remained far from her reach. Tomorrow, she told herself, she would begin looking for answers, even if it meant asking questions no one wanted to hear. As sleep finally began to take her, one thought remained clear in her mind. Someone within those palace walls knew the truth, and she was determined to find out exactly what that truth was, no matter how long it took or how far she had to go to uncover it. The knock came just after sunrise, sharp and unfamiliar, and Ilara flinched before she even opened her eyes. For a moment she thought the guards had come again, that Edmund Price stood outside with another folded paper bearing the royal crest. But when her Aunt Margaret opened the door, it was only a neighbor, curious and eager for gossip, asking why the palace seamstress had returned to the village so suddenly. Ilara stayed in the back room, listening as her aunt gave vague, careful answers, protecting her from prying eyes. But she knew the questions would not stop there. Word traveled fast in the small village, and by midday, half the street seemed to know that she had come home in disgrace. She spent that first full day indoors, unwilling to face the whispers she imagined following her through the lanes. Her aunt brought her food and tried to keep her spirits from sinking too low. But Ilara could feel herself slipping into a heavy, exhausted silence. Everything she had built for herself, her skill, her reputation, her place among people she respected, seemed to have collapsed overnight, and she had no way of explaining why. By the second day, hunger for purpose outweighed her fear of judgment. She could not simply sit inside and wait for answers that might never come. She needed to work, to earn her keep, and to keep her mind occupied so it would not spiral endlessly through unanswered questions. She walked to the small market square where local women sold vegetables, eggs, and handmade goods, and asked around for anyone in need of mending or sewing work. A baker's wife, kind but hesitant, offered her a few coins to repair a torn apron. A farmer's daughter asked her to alter a dress for an upcoming wedding. It was humble work, nothing like the fine silks and velvets she had handled at the palace, but it gave her something to hold on to. As the days passed, Ilara built a small, quiet routine. She would rise early, complete whatever mending had been left at her door the night before, and deliver the finished work before midday. In the afternoons, she wandered through the village, listening carefully to conversations, hoping to catch some thread of information about the palace and the reasons behind her sudden dismissal. It was during one of these afternoons that she met Henry Dalton, a traveling merchant who supplied fine fabric and thread to several noble households, including, on occasion, the palace itself. He had stopped in the village square to rest his horses and sell a few bolts of cloth to local tailors, and Ilara approached him cautiously, recognizing his cart from her time working in the palace sewing rooms. "You look familiar," Henry said, studying her with a curious expression as she inspected a roll of pale blue silk. "Did you not work in the royal household? I believe I delivered fabric to the sewing rooms more than once when you were there." Ilara hesitated, unsure how much to reveal, but something about his open, friendly manner made her decide to trust him, at least partly. "I did," she admitted, "until recently." Henry's expression shifted, a flicker of something like recognition crossing his face. "Ah, I heard whispers about a sudden dismissal within the palace staff, though no names were given. Strange business, if you ask me. The kind of thing that makes a man wonder what is really happening behind those walls." Ilara's heart quickened. "What kind of whispers?" Henry glanced around, lowering his voice slightly. "There has been unusual tension at court these past few months. Some of the noble families have grown restless, particularly those who feel the Queen has favored certain advisors over their own interests. I have heard talk of quiet disputes, of letters exchanged that were never meant to be seen, of alliances shifting in ways that make the old guard uneasy." "Do you know anything about Lady Beatrice Sinclair?" Ilara asked, remembering the cold looks the noblewoman had given her in recent weeks. Henry's eyebrows rose slightly. "Lady Sinclair. Now there is a name that carries weight in certain circles. Her family has old ties to the throne, older than the Queen's own line, in fact. There has long been quiet resentment among some of the nobility that the crown passed the way it did. I would not be surprised if Lady Sinclair harbored ambitions of her own, or loyalties to those who do." Ilara turned the pale blue silk over in her hands, her mind racing. "Do you think this could be connected to why I was sent away?" Henry studied her for a long moment before answering. "I could not say for certain, but if you were close to the Queen, trusted with her private garments and her private conversations, then you may have known more than you realized. Sometimes, the safest thing a person in power can do for someone they care about is push them away, especially if danger is close. The words settled over Alara like a slow revelation. She thought again of the Queen's face in the window on that final morning, the sorrow etched into her expression, the way she had watched in silence rather than intervening. Perhaps Henry was right. Perhaps her dismissal had not been punishment at all, but protection. Before she could ask him more questions, Henry was called away by another customer, and their conversation ended abruptly. But his words stayed with her for the rest of the day, turning over and over in her mind as she walked back toward her aunt's cottage in the fading afternoon light. That evening, while sorting through her small sewing kit to prepare for the next day's work, Alara noticed something odd tucked into the lining of the kit's inner pocket. A small folded piece of paper she did not remember placing there. Her fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded it, revealing a short line of handwriting she did not recognize. The words were strange, a series of letters and numbers that made no immediate sense. She stared at the paper for a long time, turning it over, searching for any additional clue. It did not look like ordinary handwriting meant for casual reading. It looked deliberate, careful, as though someone had wanted the message hidden from anyone who might glance at it without knowing what to look for. She thought back to her final days at the palace, trying to remember if anyone had been near her sewing kit, if anyone could have slipped the paper inside without her noticing. She remembered a moment, just 2 days before her dismissal, when she had left her kit unattended in the sewing room while fetching more thread from the storage closet. Anyone could have accessed it during those few minutes. Her aunt found her still staring at the paper late that night, her tea long gone cold beside her. "What is that?" Margaret asked, peering over her shoulder. "I do not know," Alara admitted. "I found it hidden in my sewing kit. I think someone placed it there before I left the palace." Margaret took the paper and examined it carefully, her brow furrowed in concentration. "This looks like some kind of code. My father used to work as a clerk for a merchant family, and he once showed me letters written this way, meant to be understood only by those who knew the cipher. Do you know how to read it?" Margaret shook her head slowly. "No, but I know someone who might. There is an old scholar who lives on the edge of the village, a man named Oliver Bramwell. He used to work as a tutor for noble families before he retired here. If anyone in this village understands old codes and ciphers, it would be him." The following morning, Alara made her way to the small stone cottage at the edge of the village, where Oliver Bramwell lived alone among towers of old books and papers. He was an elderly man with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing, and when Alara showed him the folded paper, his expression grew serious almost immediately. "Where did you find this?" he asked, turning the paper carefully in his weathered hands. "Hidden in my sewing kit, from my time working at the palace," Alara replied. "I do not know who left it there." Oliver studied the letters and numbers for a long moment, occasionally muttering to himself as he worked through the pattern. Finally, he looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "This is a simple substitution cipher, the kind used by certain court officials for private correspondence. It will take me some time to decode it fully, but I can already tell you one thing. This was not written by an ordinary hand. Whoever wrote this had training in formal court communication." Ilara's pulse quickened. "Can you tell what it says?" "Give me until tomorrow," Oliver said. "I will need time to work through it properly. But I will tell you this much, child. Whatever this message contains, it was important enough for someone to hide it carefully, and dangerous enough that they did not dare simply hand it to you directly." Alara left his cottage with her mind spinning, the pieces of the mystery slowly beginning to take shape, though the full picture remained frustratingly out of reach. As she walked back through the village, she felt a strange mixture of fear and determination settling over her. Someone within the palace had wanted her to find this message, even if they could not risk delivering it openly. On her way home, she passed the village inn, a modest building where travelers often stopped for the night on their journey between towns. She noticed a fine carriage parked outside, far grander than anything usually seen in a village this small, its dark wood polished and its wheels trimmed in silver. Curious despite herself, she slowed her pace, and as she did, the carriage door opened and a woman stepped out, dressed in rich fabric that Alara recognized instantly from her years working with court garments. It took her only a moment to place the face. It was one of Lady Beatrice Sinclair's personal attendants, a woman named Constance who had often accompanied her mistress to fittings in the palace sewing rooms. Alara froze, uncertain whether to continue walking or turn quickly down a side street to avoid being seen. Before she could decide, Constance's eyes swept across the street and landed directly on her. For a long, tense moment, neither of them moved. Then Constance offered a thin, polite smile and gave a small nod. as though greeting a distant acquaintance, before turning and disappearing into the inn. Ilara's heart pounded as she hurried the rest of the way home, glancing over her shoulder more than once to make certain she was not being followed. She told her aunt about the encounter as soon as she arrived, and Margaret's face grew troubled. What would one of Lady Sinclair's attendants be doing in a village this small, so far from the noble estates? That is no coincidence, Ilara. Do you think they know about the note? Ilara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I do not know, Margaret admitted, but it would be wise to be careful. If someone at court suspects that information has reached you, they may try to silence it before it spreads further. The warning settled heavily over Ilara for the rest of the day. She tried to keep herself occupied with mending work, but her hands felt clumsy, her concentration broken by every unfamiliar sound outside the cottage. When evening came, she found herself glancing repeatedly toward the window, half expecting to see a shadow moving in the darkness beyond the glass. Sleep came slowly again that night, and when it finally did, her dreams were filled with fragmented images, the Queen's sorrowful face in the window, the strange cipher on the folded paper, and Constance's cool, knowing smile outside the village inn. She woke before dawn, her body tense and her mind already racing toward the answers she hoped Oliver Bramwell would soon provide. That night, sleep came slowly again, her thoughts circling endlessly around the hidden note, Henry's warnings about the tensions at court, and the haunting image of the Queen watching silently from her window. Whatever truth awaited her, Ilara now understood with growing certainty that her sudden dismissal was only the beginning of a much larger story, one that reached deep into the heart of the palace she had once called home. The next morning, before she could even finish her breakfast, a soft knock came at the door. When Margaret opened it, a young boy stood outside, breathless from running, holding a small sealed note addressed simply to Ilara Whitmore. There was no name of a sender, only a single wax seal pressed into the paper, a symbol Ilara recognized instantly from her years spent among the palace linens and letters. It was a mark reserved only for the Queen's most private correspondence, and her hands trembled as she reached out to take it. "Who gave this to you?" Ilara asked the boy, crouching down to meet his eyes. The boy shrugged, catching his breath. "A man on a horse, at the edge of the village. He gave me a coin and told me to bring it here quickly, and to tell no one where it came from. Did you see which way he went?" The boy shook his head. "He rode off toward the north road before I even reached your door." Ilara thanked him and watched as he ran off toward the market square, likely eager to spend his coin before anyone questioned where he had gotten it. She closed the door slowly, the sealed letter heavy in her hands, and turned to find her aunt watching her with an expression caught somewhere between hope and worry. "Well," Margaret said quietly, "are you going to open it?" Ilara's fingers hovered over the wax seal for a long moment. Everything about the last few days, the sudden dismissal, the hidden cipher, the woman outside the inn, seemed to be building toward whatever words waited inside this letter. She took a slow breath, broke the seal, and unfolded the paper with trembling hands, ready to finally learn the truth that had been kept from her. The letter was short, only a few lines, but each word landed with the weight of a small thunderclap. "Trust no one but the bearer of this seal. Wait for further word. Your dismissal was not what it seemed. The Queen." Ilara read it twice, then a third time, her eyes tracing over the familiar, elegant handwriting she had seen countless times on fabric orders and private notes left in the sewing room. There was no mistaking it. This was the Queen's own hand. She showed the letter to her aunt, whose face shifted from confusion to cautious hope as she read the brief message. "This confirms what Henry suggested," Margaret said. "You were not dismissed out of anger or punishment. Someone wanted you away from the palace, and the Queen allowed it, perhaps even arranged it, to keep you safe." "But safe from what?" Ilara asked, folding the letter carefully and tucking it into the lining of her sewing kit, in the very same place where the hidden cipher had been discovered days earlier. Before Margaret could answer, another knock sounded at the door, softer this time. When she opened it, Oliver Bramwell stood outside, a folded piece of paper in his weathered hands, and an expression of quiet urgency on his face. "I finished decoding the message," he said without preamble, stepping inside at Margaret's gesture. "You should sit down before I tell you what it says." Ilara lowered herself onto a wooden chair by the fire, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Oliver spread the decoded message on the table before her, his voice low as he explained each line. "The cipher contains a warning," he said. "It speaks of a plan among certain court nobles to remove the Queen's influence over key decisions, using forged documents and false testimony to convince the royal council that she has grown unfit to guide the kingdom. It mentioned specific names, including Lady Beatrice Sinclair and a nobleman named Lord Nathaniel Grey. Alara's breath caught. Lord Grey. I have heard that name mentioned in the palace before, always in hushed, careful tones. He is a powerful man, Oliver confirmed, with strong ties to the old nobility and a reputation for ruthless ambition. If he is working alongside Lady Sinclair, then this conspiracy reaches further than simple court gossip. This is a plan to seize real power. But why would this note be hidden in my sewing kit? Elara asked. What does any of this have to do with me? Oliver studied the decoded message once more before answering. There is a final line here, one that took me the longest to translate correctly. It says that the seamstress must be protected, for she has seen what should not be known. I believe, Elara, that you witnessed something during your time at the palace, something that made you a danger to these conspirators without you even realizing it. Elara's mind raced backward through her final weeks of service, searching desperately for any memory that might explain Oliver's words. She thought of the missing letter from the Queen's writing desk, the hushed conversation between guards about strangers near the palace walls, the unusual questions the Queen had asked her about enemies, and unusual requests. Slowly, a memory surfaced that she had nearly forgotten entirely. There was an evening, she said slowly. About 2 weeks before I was dismissed, I was delivering a repaired gown to Lady Sinclair's chambers late in the evening. After most of the household had already retired, I heard voices through a partially open door. Lady Sinclair's voice, and a man's voice I did not recognize at the time. They were discussing documents and signatures, and someone they referred to only as their patron among the council. Did they see you? Margaret asked, alarm evident in her voice. I do not think so, Elara said, though uncertainty crept into her tone even as she spoke. I delivered the gown to another attendant and left quickly. I did not think much of it at the time. Court nobles often speak of business matters I do not understand. Oliver nodded slowly. But if that man's voice belonged to Lord Grey, and if they realized afterward that you may have overheard something important, that would explain everything. Your sudden dismissal would have served two purposes at once, removing you from the palace where they could more easily control what you might reveal, and giving the Queen a reason to distance herself from you publicly, protecting you both from suspicion. The pieces were beginning to form a clearer picture, though the full shape of the conspiracy remained frustratingly out of reach. Elara felt a strange mixture of fear and clarity settling over her, the fog of confusion that had surrounded her dismissal finally beginning to lift, even as new dangers came into focus. What do we do now? She asked, looking between her aunt and the old scholar. We wait, Oliver said firmly. The Queen instructed you to wait for further word, and I believe that is wise counsel. If these conspirators suspect that you know something, moving carelessly now could put you in far greater danger than you already face. Days passed slowly after that conversation, each one stretching with tense anticipation. Elara continued her small mending work in the village, trying to maintain some semblance of normal routine, though her mind remained constantly alert to unfamiliar faces and unusual visitors passing through the streets. She noticed, more than once, a man in plain traveling clothes who seemed to linger near the market square longer than any ordinary business would require, though she could never be certain whether he was watching her or simply resting on his journey elsewhere. One afternoon, while walking back from delivering a mended coat to a farmer at the edge of the village, Elara noticed the same man in plain traveling clothes standing near the old stone well, watching her with an attention that felt far too deliberate to be accidental. She quickened her pace, taking a longer route home through a narrow lane between two cottages, and when she glanced back, the man was gone. Her heart continued to pound long after she reached her aunt's door, and she said nothing that evening, unwilling to worry Margaret further, without any real proof of danger. 2 days later, the same man appeared again, this time standing across from the small shop where Elara had gone to purchase thread. She caught his reflection in the shop window, watching her through the glass rather than looking directly at her, a habit that struck her as deliberately careful, the behavior of someone accustomed to observing without being noticed. When she stepped outside, he had already turned and begun walking in the opposite direction, disappearing around a corner before she could get a clear look at his face. That night, she finally told her aunt what she had seen, and Margaret's expression grew tight with worry. You must be more careful than ever now, she said. If Lord Grey's people have already found you here, then whatever protection the Queen's dismissal provided may be running out. The fear of being watched settled over Elara like a heavy blanket in the days that followed, coloring every errand and every walk through the village with a constant, low hum of anxiety. She began varying her routes, avoiding certain streets at certain hours, and keeping the folded letter and decoded cipher hidden beneath a loose floorboard beneath her bed, rather than in her sewing kit, where anyone searching her belongings might easily find them. One evening, nearly a week after receiving the Queen's brief letter, Elara returned home to find her aunt speaking quietly with a stranger at their kitchen table, a woman dressed in the simple, practical clothing of a traveling servant, though something about her posture and careful manner of speech suggested a more refined background than her clothing implied. "Elara," Margaret said, rising quickly. "This is Grace. She says she carries word from the palace." Grace studied Elara carefully before speaking, as though weighing exactly how much could be safely said within the walls of a village cottage. "I serve the Queen in a private capacity," she said finally, her voice measured and quiet. "She sends her deepest regret for the fear and confusion you have suffered these past days. She wished to explain everything herself, but circumstances at court have made open communication dangerous for you both." "Is it true then?" Elara asked. "Was I sent away to protect me?" Grace nodded. "The Queen discovered, shortly before your dismissal, that Lord Grey and Lady Sinclair had grown suspicious of a seamstress who moved freely through private chambers and heard conversations not meant for servant ears. She learned they intended to have you quietly removed, in ways far less gentle than a simple dismissal, unless she acted first to place you beyond their immediate reach." A cold shiver ran through Elara at the implication behind those words. "They meant to harm me." "Yes," Grace said simply, without softening the truth. "The Queen could not warn you directly without risking exposure of her own knowledge of the plot, so she ordered your dismissal herself, publicly and swiftly, removing you from danger while appearing, to anyone watching, as though she had simply lost confidence in your service. It was the only way she could think to protect you without revealing that she already suspected the conspiracy forming around her." Elara absorbed this information slowly, her earlier hurt and confusion transforming gradually into something closer to gratitude, mixed still with fear for what might come next. "What does she need from me now?" Grace glanced toward the window, as though checking for any watchful eyes beyond the glass, before continuing. "The Queen needs evidence, proof strong enough to convince the Royal Council that Lord Grey and Lady Sinclair are conspiring against the Crown. Suspicion alone will not be enough to move against nobles of their standing. She believes that what you overheard that evening in Lady Sinclair's chambers may be connected to documents they are still preparing, forged papers meant to discredit her before the council. How can I possibly help with that from here?" Elara asked. "I have no access to the palace any longer." Grace's expression grew serious. "That is precisely why I have come. The Queen wishes to bring you back into the palace, quietly, under a new identity and a different role, one that will allow you to move through certain areas without drawing suspicion. It is a dangerous request, and she would understand completely if you refused, but she believes you may be the only person capable of finding proof before the conspirators complete their plan." Elara sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of the decision settling heavily over her. Returning to the palace meant stepping directly back into danger, placing herself within reach of the very people who may have already considered having her silenced. Yet staying away meant leaving the Queen to face this threat with fewer resources, fewer allies she could fully trust. She thought of the sorrow she had seen in the Queen's face on that final morning, the silent watching from the window as guards led her away. She thought of the warmth and trust that had grown between them over 3 years of quiet conversations and careful stitching. And she thought of the danger that now hung over the entire kingdom if men like Lord Grey succeeded in seizing power through lies and forged documents. "I will go," Elara said finally, her voice steady despite the fear still coiling in her chest. "Tell the Queen I am ready to help, whatever the risk." Grace studied her for a long moment, something like respect flickering across her careful expression. "You understand this will not be simple. You will need to adopt a new name, a new history, and you must be prepared to convince even those who once knew you that you are someone else entirely. One mistake, one moment of recognition from the wrong person, could put both you and the Queen in grave danger." "I understand," Elara said, gripping her aunt's hand tightly beside her. "When do we leave?" 3 days from now," Grace replied. "A carriage will come for you after nightfall, on the north road beyond the village boundary. Tell no one of your departure, not even close friends. The fewer people who know, the safer you will remain." After Grace left as quietly as she had arrived, Elara sat with her aunt long into the night, discussing the plan in hushed, careful tones. Margaret's worry was plain on her face, though she did not try to talk Elara out of her decision. "You have always had more courage than you realized," Margaret said softly, brushing a strand of hair from Elara's face. "Just promise me you will be careful, whatever happens within those palace walls. Come home to me safely when it is finished. I promise, Elara said, though even as she spoke the words, she understood how uncertain that promise truly was. Over the following 3 days, she prepared quietly for her return, memorizing details of the new identity Grace had left with her, a modest background story involving a distant cousin's household and a fabricated name, Marianne Foley, chosen specifically because it bore no resemblance to anything connected with her true past. She practiced small changes to her posture and manner of speech, subtle enough to avoid suspicion but distinct enough to separate Marianne Foley from the seamstress who had once served the Queen so openly. Grace had also left detailed instructions about the role Elara would take on within the palace, no longer working directly in the sewing rooms where she might be recognized by former colleagues, but instead assigned to the household of a minor court official whose duties occasionally brought him into contact with Lord Grey's private staff. This new position, though far less familiar than her old work, would give her a legitimate reason to move through certain corridors and observe certain meetings without drawing immediate suspicion, provided she played her part convincingly. She practiced walking with a slightly different gait, lowering her voice, and adjusting the way she held her hands while working. Small details that Grace had warned could be the difference between blending into her new role and being recognized by someone who had once known her well. Her aunt helped her rehearse possible questions she might be asked about her fabricated past, testing her late into the evening until the answers came without hesitation, without the telltale pause of someone constructing a lie in real time. On the second night of preparation, doubt crept into Elara's thoughts as she lay awake, staring at the ceiling of her childhood bedroom. She wondered whether she truly possessed the skill to deceive people who had known her for years, whether one careless glance or familiar habit might undo everything before she even had the chance to find the evidence the Queen so desperately needed. Yet beneath that doubt ran a steadier current of resolve, born from the memory of the Queen's sorrowful face in the window, and from her own growing anger at men like Lord Grey, who seemed willing to tear apart trust and safety within the kingdom simply to serve their own ambitions. By the third day, she felt as ready as she could hope to be. She packed a small bag with only the barest essentials, leaving behind anything that might connect her to her old identity, and tucked the hidden letter and decoded cipher into a pouch, stitched carefully into the lining of her cloak, close enough to her body that no casual search would easily uncover them. On the third night, as promised, a plain, unmarked carriage arrived at the edge of the North Road, just as darkness fully settled over the village. Elara said a tearful goodbye to her aunt, promising once more to be careful, before climbing into the carriage and beginning the journey back toward the palace she had once been forced to leave under such painful circumstances. As the carriage rattled along the dark road, Elara stared out at the passing shadows of trees and fields, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. She did not know exactly what awaited her within those familiar walls, but she understood, with growing clarity, that the quiet, simple life she had once lived as a palace seamstress was gone forever. Whatever came next, she would need every ounce of courage she possessed to see it through. Grace sat across from her in the swaying carriage, watching the passing countryside with a calm, practiced stillness that Elara found herself trying to imitate. "Remember," Grace said quietly, breaking the long silence between them. "From this moment forward, you are Marianne Foley. Even here, in this carriage, it is wise to practice thinking of yourself that way. The mind grows careless when it believes safety has already been reached." Elara nodded, repeating the false name silently to herself, feeling the strange weight of shedding her own identity like an old coat no longer fit to wear. "Will I see the Queen again, once we arrive?" "Not immediately," Grace said. "It would be far too dangerous for you to be seen anywhere near her private chambers until your new position is firmly established and accepted among the household staff. Patience will serve you better than urgency in the days ahead." The carriage continued through the darkness, the distant lights of the palace slowly growing visible on the horizon as the night wore on, tall towers rising against the star-filled sky like silent sentinels guarding secrets Elara was only beginning to understand. She thought of her aunt, alone now in the small cottage, and of Oliver Bramwell, who had promised to continue searching for any further clues hidden within old court records he still had access to through former acquaintances. She thought, too, of Henry Dalton, whose casual warning in the village square had first set her on this path toward the truth. As the palace walls grew closer, looming larger with every passing minute, Elara felt the last remnants of her old life falling away, replaced by the careful, deliberate persona of Marianne Foley, a stranger stepping into danger with nothing but courage and a fragile hope that the truth, once uncovered, would be enough to set things right. The carriage did not approach the main gates of the palace, but instead turned down a narrow, overgrown path that led toward a smaller entrance near the eastern wall, one Alara had never used during her years working openly as a seamstress. Grace led her through the darkened doorway and down a series of quiet corridors, moving with the confidence of someone who had walked this route many times before. They stopped outside a modest room near the servants' quarters, sparsely furnished but clean, with a narrow bed and a small writing desk beneath a shuttered window. "This will be your room," Grace said quietly. "Tomorrow morning, you will be introduced to the household staff as Marianne Foley, newly hired to assist in the record-keeping office under Master Ellery Combe. He believes you come recommended through a distant family connection. He does not know the truth, and it must remain that way." Alara nodded, setting her small bag down on the narrow bed. "And the Queen? When will I see her?" "Soon," Grace promised. "But not tonight. Rest now. Tomorrow begins the harder part of this task." Sleep came slowly that first night back within the palace walls, the familiar sounds of distant footsteps and quiet voices through thin walls bringing back memories she had tried to push aside during her weeks in the village. By morning she rose before dawn, dressed in the plain, practical clothing Grace had left for her, and prepared herself mentally to step fully into the role of Marianne Foley. Master Ellery Combe turned out to be an older man with a kind, distracted manner, more interested in the neat organization of his ledgers than in questioning the background of his new assistant. He showed her briefly around the record-keeping office, a modest room filled with tall shelves of documents, correspondence, and administrative papers related to the daily operations of the palace household. "Most of your work will involve copying and filing," he explained, gesturing toward a stack of papers waiting on her assigned desk. "Occasionally, you may be asked to deliver documents to other offices within the palace, including those belonging to certain court officials. Discretion is expected at all times. Much of what passes through this office is not meant for casual conversation." Alara nodded, keeping her expression carefully neutral despite the small thrill of opportunity his words suggested. If her duties included delivering documents to other offices, she might eventually find a legitimate reason to move closer to the areas where Lord Grey and Lady Sinclair conducted their private business. The first several days passed slowly, filled with tedious copying work that gave her little opportunity to investigate anything beyond the walls of the record-keeping office. She used the time carefully, however, studying the layout of the palace as it had changed since her departure, memorizing the schedules of various officials, and listening attentively to the quiet gossip exchanged among the clerks and messengers who passed through the office throughout the day. It was during her second week that she first heard Lord Grey's name mentioned directly. A young clerk named Peter, delivering a stack of correspondence, mentioned in passing that Lord Grey's private secretary had requested an unusually large number of blank formal documents bearing the royal seal template, papers typically used only for official proclamations requiring the Queen's direct authorization. "Strange request," Peter commented to another clerk as he set the papers down. "Why would Lord Grey's office need so many blank formal templates, unless they intend to draft something requiring the Queen's seal?" Alara kept her eyes fixed on her copying work, careful not to appear too interested, though her pulse quickened at the mention of Lord Grey's office requesting materials that could easily be used to forge official documents. This detail matched exactly what the decoded cipher had warned about: forged papers meant to discredit the Queen before the Royal Council. That evening, following the careful protocol Grace had established for passing information, Alara left a small folded note beneath a loose stone near the kitchen garden, a message describing what she had overheard about the blank templates. The following morning the note was gone, replaced by a short reply instructing her to continue observing quietly and report any further details about Lord Grey's activities. Over the following days, Alara found small, careful ways to extend her reach within the palace without drawing suspicion. She volunteered for additional document deliveries whenever possible, using each errand as an opportunity to observe the comings and goings around Lord Grey's private offices and Lady Sinclair's chambers. She noted which officials visited most frequently, which hours seemed busiest with unusual activity, and which servants appeared unusually secretive about their duties. One afternoon, while delivering a stack of routine correspondence to an office near Lord Grey's chambers, Alara noticed a familiar figure exiting through a side door, moving quickly and glancing nervously over her shoulder. It was Constance, the same attendant she had seen outside the village inn weeks earlier, now clearly established within Lord Grey's household rather than simply accompanying Lady Sinclair on occasional visits. Alara ducked quickly into a side alcove, pretending to organize the papers in her arms, watching as Constance hurried past without noticing her. The encounter confirmed what she had already begun to suspect, that Lady Sinclair and Lord Grey were working closely together, their households intertwined in ways that went far beyond simple social alliance. A few days after spotting Constance near Lord Grey's chambers, Ilara nearly made a fatal mistake. She had volunteered to deliver a set of documents to an office adjacent to the private archive room, hoping for another chance to observe the comings and goings around its heavy locked door. As she approached the corridor, she heard footsteps rounding the corner ahead, and quickly ducked into a narrow alcove between two tall bookshelves, pressing herself flat against the cool stone wall. Lord Nathaniel Grey himself passed within only a few feet of her hiding place, deep in conversation with another man Ilara did not recognize, their voices low but audible in the quiet corridor. "The council meets in 11 days, Lord Grey said, his tone clipped and businesslike. "Everything must be finalized before then. Any delay increases the risk of discovery." "The documents are nearly complete," the other man replied. "Constance has been careful. No one suspects anything within the household staff." "See that it stays that way," Lord Grey said, his footsteps continuing past Ilara's hiding place without pause. "I will not have this unravel because of careless attendants gossiping where they should not." Ilara remained frozen in the alcove long after their voices faded, her heart hammering so loudly she feared it might somehow be heard through the stone walls. The timeline Lord Grey had mentioned, 11 days until the council meeting, gave her a critical piece of information, a deadline against which she would now have to race if she hoped to find proof before the forged documents were presented. She waited several more minutes before finally continuing on her errand, delivering the documents with hands that trembled only slightly, and returning to the record-keeping office with the new information burning urgently in her mind. That evening she wrote a detailed report describing the overheard conversation, the confirmed 11-day timeline, and everything else she had observed about the movements around Lord Grey's and Lady Sinclair's private quarters in recent days. As she tucked the folded paper beneath the garden stone, a soft voice startled her from the shadows nearby. "You are doing well," the voice said quietly, and Ilara turned to find Grace standing partially hidden behind a tall hedge, her expression calm despite the late hour. "The Queen has read your reports. She wishes to see you directly, tonight, if you are willing." Ilara's heart leapt with a mixture of relief and renewed anxiety. "Now? Is it safe?" "As safe as anything within these walls can be," Grace replied. "Follow me, and stay close. We must move quickly and quietly." Grace led her through a series of narrow, unfamiliar passages, some clearly built into the palace's older architecture and rarely used by ordinary staff, until they reached a small, private study tucked away from the main corridors. Inside, illuminated by a single candle, stood the Queen herself, dressed simply, without the elaborate formal attire Ilara remembered from her years of service. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The Queen studied Ilara's face carefully, as though searching for the young seamstress she remembered beneath the careful disguise of Marianne Foley. Then, slowly, her composed expression softened into something closer to genuine relief. "Ilara," she said quietly, "I am so sorry for everything you have endured because of my choices. I did not want to send you away like that, in fear and confusion, but I saw no other way to protect you quickly enough." "I understand now," Ilara said, her voice unsteady with emotion she had not expected to feel so strongly upon finally seeing the Queen again. Grace explained everything. "I am grateful you trusted me enough to bring me back." The Queen gestured toward a small chair near her writing desk, inviting Ilara to sit. "I need to explain the full scope of what we are facing, so you understand exactly what is at stake, and exactly how dangerous this task has become." Over the next hour, the Queen described in careful detail the growing conspiracy she had uncovered over recent months, beginning with quiet whispers among certain council members, questioning her judgment on matters of trade and foreign alliance. Whispers she now believed had been deliberately planted by Lord Grey and his allies, to slowly erode confidence in her leadership among the nobility. "They intend to present forged documents before the full council," the Queen explained. "Papers designed to appear as though I authorized decisions that never truly received my approval. Decisions that would appear reckless or even treasonous if presented without proper context. If they succeed in convincing enough council members that these documents are genuine, they could argue for my removal from active governance, placing power instead into the hands of a regency council conveniently filled with their own allies." "And the documents Lord Grey's office requested," Ilara said slowly. "The blank templates bearing the royal seal design, that is how they intend to create these forgeries." The Queen nodded gravely. "Exactly. Which is why finding proof of their forgery before they present these documents to the council is so critical. Without evidence proving the documents are false, my word alone may not be enough to counter such a carefully constructed conspiracy." What do you need me to do? Alara asked, steadying her voice despite the fear coiling tighter in her chest with every detail the Queen revealed. I need you to find where they are creating these forgeries, the Queen said. If we can locate the actual documents before they are presented, along with any evidence connecting Lord Grey and Lady Sinclair directly to their creation, we can expose the conspiracy before it ever reaches the council floor. Alara took a deep breath, thinking of everything she had already observed during her weeks working as Marianne Foley. The frequent deliveries between Lord Grey's and Lady Sinclair's offices, the secretive movements of attendants like Constance, the unusual requests for formal document templates. I believe I may already know where to begin looking, she said finally. There is a private archive room near Lord Grey's offices that few staff members are permitted to enter. I have seen Constance moving in and out of it several times over the past week, always carrying sealed folders. The Queen's expression sharpened with cautious hope. If that room contains what we suspect, finding a way inside could provide exactly the evidence we need. But you must be extremely careful, Alara. If they discover you searching through their private materials, the consequences could be far more severe than a simple dismissal. There is something else, Alara added, remembering the conversation she had overheard in the corridor. I heard Lord Grey speak of the council meeting directly. It takes place in 11 days. Whatever we intend to do, it must be finished before then. The Queen's face tightened at the confirmation of the timeline. 11 days is very little time, but it is more warning than I had before tonight. I will need to think carefully about how to prepare the council for what may come, without revealing too much before we have proof in hand. In the meantime, your task becomes even more urgent. I understand the risk, Alara said, meeting the Queen's eyes with steady resolve, but I am prepared to take it, for you, and for the kingdom. The Queen reached across the small table between them and gently took Alara's hand, an unexpected gesture of warmth that carried the weight of genuine gratitude and deep concern. Be careful, my dear friend. Whatever happens, know that your courage in returning here means more to me than you may ever fully understand. Before Alara left the study, the Queen rose and crossed to a small locked cabinet beside her writing desk, retrieving a slim metal tool that resembled a lockpick, though finer and more delicately made than anything Alara had seen before. This belonged to my late father, the Queen said, pressing it into Alara's palm. He believed every ruler should understand the mechanisms of security within their own palace, if only to guard against those who might misuse them. I hope you will not need it, but if the archive room proves locked when you find your opportunity, this may serve you better than waiting for someone to leave a door carelessly open. Alara closed her fingers around the small tool, feeling its cool weight settle against her palm like a promise. Thank you. I will use it wisely. One more thing, the Queen added, her voice softening. Whatever you find, do not attempt to remove it from the archive room yourself if you believe you are at risk of being caught. Send word through Grace immediately, and we will determine together how best to retrieve it safely. Your life matters more to me than any document, however important it may be to proving this conspiracy. As Alara left the private study that night, guided once again through the hidden passages by Grace's careful lead, she felt a renewed sense of purpose settling over her, sharpening her focus for the dangerous task that lay ahead. Somewhere within Lord Grey's private archive room lay the proof needed to unravel the entire conspiracy, and she was determined to find it, no matter the risk involved. The 11 days ahead felt impossibly short once Alara returned to her small room near the servants' quarters, the small lockpick tool tucked carefully into a hidden pocket sewn into her cloak. She spent the following day at her usual duties in the record-keeping office, her mind constantly working through possible ways to gain access to the private archive room without drawing suspicion. The room itself sat at the end of a quiet corridor near Lord Grey's offices, its heavy wooden door secured with a lock far sturdier than anything else in that section of the palace. Alara had passed it many times during her document deliveries, always noting the guard who occasionally stood watch nearby, though his presence seemed inconsistent, appearing at some hours and absent at others. She spent 2 full days simply observing the pattern of activity around the archive room, noting when the guard was present, when Constance or other attendants entered and exited, and when the corridor sat empty for extended periods. She discovered that the guard typically took his evening meal between the hours of 7 and 8, leaving the corridor unwatched for nearly an entire hour each night. During those 2 days of careful watching, Alara also took note of smaller details that might prove useful. The exact placement of the guard's chair beside the door, the particular creak of a floorboard just inside the corridor entrance, and the fact that a narrow window near the far end of the hallway remained unlatched during the warmer afternoon hours, likely for ventilation, though it offered no practical entrance given its height above the ground. She sketched a rough mental map of the corridor and its surrounding rooms, committing every detail to memory in case she needed to move quickly or find an alternate route of escape. She also grew more attentive to the rhythms of the wider household during this time, learning which servants tended to linger in certain hallways for gossip, which hours saw the heaviest foot traffic near the kitchens, and when the palace settled into its quietest stretches of the night. This broader awareness, she realized, might prove just as important as her specific knowledge of the archive room itself, since any unexpected encounter in the wrong corridor could unravel her plan just as easily as being caught inside the room itself. On the third night of her observation, she decided the time had come to act. She waited until the dinner hour approached, then made her way quietly through the darkening corridors, carrying a small lantern shielded carefully to minimize its light. Her heart pounded with every step, each shadow along the walls seeming to shift and threaten discovery, though she forced herself to maintain a calm, purposeful pace, the same measured walk she had practiced as Marianne Foley. The corridor near the archive room stood empty, just as she had hoped. She approached the heavy door, glancing once more in each direction to confirm she was truly alone, before kneeling and inserting the delicate lockpick tool the Queen had given her. Her hands trembled slightly as she worked, recalling vague instructions Grace had once given her about the mechanism of simple locks, though she had never actually attempted such a task before. Long minutes passed, each one stretching with unbearable tension, before she finally felt the lock give way beneath her careful manipulation. She slipped inside quickly, closing the door softly behind her, and allowed herself only a brief moment to catch her breath before turning her attention to the room around her. The archive room was smaller than she had expected, lined with tall shelves holding neatly organized folders and boxes, each labeled with careful, precise handwriting. She moved quickly along the shelves, searching for anything related to formal documents or council proceedings, her small shielded lantern casting a narrow, careful beam of light across the labels. Near the back of the room, she found a locked wooden chest tucked beneath the lowest shelf, distinct from the ordinary folders and boxes surrounding it. Something about its careful placement, hidden away from casual view, told her this was likely where the most sensitive materials would be kept. She knelt before it and applied the lockpick once more, her hands steadier now with the small confidence gained from her earlier success. The chest opened with a soft click, revealing a stack of documents bearing the royal seal template Peter had mentioned weeks earlier in the record-keeping office. Ilara lifted the top few papers carefully, scanning their contents by the dim light of her lantern, and felt her breath catch as she began to understand exactly what she had found. The documents were drafts of official proclamations, written in a formal style clearly intended to mimic the Queen's own manner of speech, describing decisions regarding trade agreements and foreign alliances that Ilara knew, from her time working closely with the Queen, had never actually been discussed or approved. Beside the drafts lay several practice sheets showing repeated attempts at forging the Queen's distinctive signature, some crossed out with corrections, others nearly perfect in their imitation. She had found exactly what the Queen needed, undeniable proof of forgery, prepared and ready for presentation before the Royal Council. Beneath the drafts, she also discovered a small ledger written in Lord Grey's own hand, detailing payments made to several individuals whose names she did not recognize, alongside brief notes referencing tasks such as securing documents and maintaining silence among certain staff. The ledger, though brief, seemed to confirm that the conspiracy extended beyond Lord Grey and Lady Sinclair alone, drawing in others within the palace who had likely been paid to look away from unusual activity, or to actively assist in gathering materials needed for the forgery. Working as quickly as she dared, she selected several of the most damning documents, the forged signature practice sheets, two of the most clearly fraudulent proclamation drafts, and the small ledger of payments, and tucked them carefully into the hidden pocket sewn into her cloak alongside the lockpick tool. She hesitated briefly over whether to take more, knowing that each additional document increased the risk of the missing materials being noticed too quickly, but decided that what she had gathered would likely be sufficient to convince even the most skeptical council members of the conspiracy's true scope. As she prepared to close the chest and slip quietly back out of the archive room, the sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor outside sent a jolt of pure fear through her entire body. She quickly closed the chest, though without time to properly relock it, and extinguished her lantern, pressing herself into the shadowed corner behind the tallest shelf just as the door creaked open. Constance entered the room, carrying her own small lantern, her expression distracted as she moved toward a different shelf near the entrance. Ilara held perfectly still, scarcely daring to breathe, watching through the narrow gap between shelves as Constance retrieved a folder and began flipping through its contents, seemingly unaware of anything amiss within the room. For several agonizing minutes, Constance remained near the entrance, occasionally muttering to herself as she searched through the folder's contents. Elara's legs began to ache from her frozen position, and she felt sweat forming along her brow despite the cool air of the archive room, terrified that the slightest sound or movement might draw Constance's attention toward the shadows where she hid. At one point, Constance paused and turned her head slightly toward the back of the room, as though some small sound or shifting shadow had caught her attention. Elara's heart seemed to stop entirely in that moment, every instinct urging her to bolt for the door despite knowing such a move would certainly end in disaster. Constance took a single step deeper into the room, her lantern light sweeping closer to the shelf where Elara stood pressed into the shadows, before a distant call from somewhere down the corridor drew her attention away. "Constance, are you finished in there? Lady Sinclair is asking for you," a voice called from beyond the door. Constance sighed, muttered something under her breath about never having a moment's peace, and turned back toward the entrance, apparently abandoning whatever had briefly caught her curiosity. Elara did not allow herself to fully exhale until she heard Constance's footsteps fade completely down the corridor outside, the narrow escape leaving her hands trembling long after the danger had passed. Finally, Constance closed the folder, tucked it beneath her arm, and turned to leave, her footsteps retreating back down the corridor outside. Elara waited several more minutes, counting her own heartbeats to steady her nerves, before finally emerging from her hiding place and making her way quickly toward the door. She paused only long enough to glance back at the wooden chest, its lid not fully secured, hoping desperately that its slightly disturbed appearance would not draw immediate suspicion before she could deliver the stolen documents to the Queen. With one final careful check of the corridor, she slipped out of the archive room and made her way back through the darkened palace toward her small room, the stolen evidence pressed tightly against her chest beneath her cloak. That night, following the same careful protocol established for passing urgent information, Elara left a message beneath the garden stone requesting an immediate meeting, rather than waiting for the usual exchange of written notes. Within an hour, Grace appeared at her door, her expression tense with the urgency of the summons. "I found them," Elara whispered, pulling the documents from their hidden pocket and showing Grace the forged signature practice sheets and fraudulent proclamation drafts. "This should be enough to prove the conspiracy, should it not?" Grace examined the documents carefully by candlelight, her expression shifting from cautious hope to something closer to genuine relief. "This is exactly what we needed. The Queen must see these immediately." They made their way once more through the hidden passages toward the Queen's private study, where she waited anxiously despite the late hour, having clearly not slept since receiving word of Elara's urgent summons. When she examined the documents Elara had recovered, her expression hardened with a mixture of anger and determination. "This confirms everything," the Queen said quietly, studying the forged signatures with careful attention. "They intended to present these as genuine proclamations, using my own supposed authorization to justify actions I never approved. This is treason, plain and undeniable." "What happens now?" Elara asked, exhaustion and lingering fear from the night's events beginning to weigh heavily upon her. "Now we prepare," the Queen said, her voice steadying with renewed resolve. "I will present these forged documents before the full council myself, exposing Lord Grey and Lady Sinclair's conspiracy, before they have the chance to present their own fraudulent version of events. But we must move carefully. If they discover the documents are missing before I am ready to act, they may attempt to destroy remaining evidence or flee before facing justice." Over the following days, the palace remained tense with an undercurrent of suspicion that Elara could feel even within the quiet confines of the record-keeping office. Word spread quickly, though carefully whispered rather than openly discussed, that something had gone missing from a private archive near Lord Grey's chambers, and that an unknown thief had somehow breached its lock without detection. Elara continued her duties as Marianne Foley with outward calm, though inwardly she remained constantly alert, watching for any sign that suspicion might fall upon her. She noticed Constance moving through the corridors with visible anxiety, and overheard fragments of tense conversation among Lord Grey's household staff, speculation about who among them might have betrayed their master's trust. 4 days before the council meeting, disaster nearly struck when Master Ellery Combe called Elara into his small office, his expression unusually serious as he studied her across his cluttered desk. "Marianne," he said slowly, "I have been asked several questions today about your background, questions I could not fully answer, since I know so little about your history beyond the recommendation that brought you to this office. Lord Grey's steward came asking about new staff members who joined the palace household in recent weeks." Elara felt her pulse quicken, though she forced her expression to remain calm and slightly confused. exactly as an innocent clerk might respond to such an unexpected inquiry. "I do not understand why anyone would take interest in someone as unremarkable as myself, sir." Master Combs studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Nor do I, truthfully. But I thought you should know, in case there is anything about your situation I ought to be aware of." "There is nothing, sir," Elara said, holding his gaze steadily despite the fear coiling tightly in her chest. "I am simply grateful for the opportunity to work here." He nodded slowly, seemingly satisfied, though something in his expression suggested lingering uncertainty. "Very well. Return to your duties then. But do take extra care in the coming days. There seems to be unusual tension throughout the household right now, and I would not want any of my staff caught up in matters that do not concern them." As Elara turned to leave his office, Master Combe added one final remark that lingered in her mind for the rest of the day. "You know, in all the years I have managed this office, I have rarely seen anyone take to the work as quickly and carefully as you have, Marianne. Whatever brought you here, I hope you find it worth the trouble." His words, kindly meant, carried an unintentional weight, given everything he did not know about her true purpose within the palace, and Elara found herself oddly moved by his simple, unknowing trust in her. Elara returned to her desk with her heart still racing, understanding clearly that Lord Grey's suspicion was growing closer, even if he had not yet identified her directly as the source of his missing documents. She used her next opportunity to leave an urgent note beneath the garden stone, warning Grace and the Queen that time was running dangerously short, and that discovery might be imminent, regardless of how carefully she continued to move through the palace corridors. The response came swiftly. The council meeting, originally scheduled for the following week, would be moved forward by 2 days, giving the Queen less time to fully prepare her case, but reducing the window during which Lord Grey's suspicions might solidify into direct accusation against Marianne Foley. The night before the meeting, Grace came to Elara's small room carrying a folded set of formal clothing, far finer than anything Marianne Foley would ordinarily wear within the record-keeping office. "The Queen wishes you to be present at the council session tomorrow," Grace explained, laying the garments carefully across the narrow bed. "Not as Marianne Foley, but as yourself. She believes your testimony, alongside the evidence you recovered, will carry far greater weight if the council understands exactly who uncovered the conspiracy and why." Elara's stomach tightened at the thought of standing before the full council, revealing her true identity after weeks of careful disguise. "Will that not put me in greater danger if Lord Grey learns who exposed him before the guards are ready to act?" "The Queen has already arranged for guards loyal to the crown to be stationed near the council chamber," Grace assured her. "The moment the evidence is presented, Lord Grey and Lady Sinclair will have no opportunity to retaliate or flee, but you must be prepared for what tomorrow will bring. Both the relief of finally seeing justice served, and the difficulty of standing before powerful nobles who will not easily accept defeat." Elara spent that final night staring at the formal clothing laid across her bed, her mind cycling through every possible outcome the following day might bring. She thought of her aunt back in the village, unaware of how close this dangerous chapter was to reaching its conclusion. She thought of Oliver Bramwell, whose careful decoding of the hidden cipher had set this entire chain of events into motion. And she thought of the Queen, whose trust in her had never wavered, even when circumstances forced them apart for weeks at a time. Sleep proved nearly impossible that night, her thoughts too crowded with anticipation and lingering fear to allow any real rest. When the first gray light of dawn finally touched the shuttered window of her small room, she rose, dressed carefully in the formal clothing Grace had provided, and prepared herself to step out of the shadows of Marianne Foley and back into her own identity, ready to face whatever consequences the council chamber would bring. The council chamber stood at the heart of the palace, a grand room with high ceilings and rows of polished wooden seats arranged in a wide half-circle facing the raised platform where the Queen would preside over the morning's proceedings. Elara had never entered this room before, not once in all her years serving as a palace seamstress, and the sheer scale of it left her feeling small and exposed as Grace led her through a side entrance reserved for witnesses and staff. She took her place in a small antechamber adjoining the main hall, waiting alongside 2 guards whose presence, Grace assured her quietly, existed solely for her protection. Through the partially open door, she could hear the low murmur of council members arriving and taking their seats, along with the distinct, confident voice of Lord Nathaniel Grey, greeting several colleagues with practiced charm. The proceedings began formally, with routine matters of trade and taxation discussed first, though Elara found it nearly impossible to focus on the distant drone of official business, her mind consumed entirely by anticipation of what was to come. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, She heard the Queen's clear voice rise above the general murmur, calling the council's attention to a matter of grave importance regarding the integrity of recent official proclamations. A tense silence fell over the chamber. Elara peered through the gap in the door and saw Lord Grey's expression shift subtly, a flicker of wariness crossing his otherwise composed features as the Queen began describing, in careful and measured tones, the discovery of forged documents bearing her seal and signature, documents never actually authorized through proper channels. "I have evidence," the Queen announced, her voice carrying clearly through the silent chamber, "that certain members of this council conspired to create fraudulent proclamations intended to discredit my judgment and justify my removal from active governance." Murmurs of shock and disbelief rippled through the assembled nobles. Lord Grey rose from his seat, his voice carrying an edge of practiced outrage. "Your Majesty, such accusations are extremely serious. Surely you do not intend to level them without clear and verifiable proof." "I do not," the Queen replied evenly, "which is why I have brought forth someone who can provide exactly that proof, along with first-hand testimony regarding the conspiracy's origins." This was Elara's signal. Grace touched her shoulder gently, and together they stepped through the doorway into the full view of the council chamber. Elara felt every eye in the room turn toward her, the weight of dozens of unfamiliar, curious gazes settling over her like a physical pressure as she walked forward to stand before the raised platform where the Queen waited. She saw Lord Grey's expression shift dramatically the moment he recognized her, the practiced calm of his features cracking briefly into something far more dangerous before he managed to compose himself once more. Lady Beatrice Sinclair, seated near him, went visibly pale, her hands gripping the arms of her chair tightly enough that her knuckles turned white. "This is Elara Whitmore," the Queen announced to the assembled council, "formerly my trusted seamstress, who was dismissed from palace service several weeks ago under circumstances I now wish to fully explain. She was not dismissed for any failure in her duties, but rather to protect her from individuals within this very chamber who feared what she may have witnessed regarding their conspiracy." A wave of stunned murmurs swept through the room once more. Elara stood as straight and composed as she could manage, drawing on every ounce of courage she possessed, as she prepared to address the council directly for the first time. "Several weeks before my dismissal," she began, her voice steadier than she had expected, "I overheard a conversation in Lady Sinclair's private chambers, between herself and a man I later confirmed to be Lord Grey, discussing documents and signatures meant for a patron among this very council. At the time, I did not understand its significance. It was only after my dismissal that I began to suspect I had witnessed something far more dangerous than ordinary court business." She proceeded to describe the events that had followed, the hidden cipher discovered in her sewing kit, the warning delivered through Henry Dalton in the village, and her eventual return to the palace under a false identity at the Queen's request. As she spoke, she noticed several council members leaning forward with growing interest, their expressions shifting from skepticism toward genuine concern, as her account unfolded with careful, consistent detail. "During my time working within the record-keeping office," she continued, "I observed unusual activity around Lord Grey's private offices, including requests for blank formal document templates bearing the royal seal design, materials with no legitimate purpose beyond creating forged proclamations." At this point, the Queen gestured toward Grace, who stepped forward carrying the documents Elara had recovered from the archive room. She presented them formally to the council's senior clerk, who examined them carefully before passing them along the row of assembled nobles for closer inspection. "These documents," the Queen explained, "include drafts of fraudulent proclamations, practice sheets showing repeated attempts to forge my signature, and a ledger detailing payments made by Lord Grey to individuals assisting in this conspiracy. They were recovered from a locked chest within a private archive room adjacent to Lord Grey's offices, exactly where Miss Whitmore's careful observation led us to search." Lord Grey rose again, his composure now visibly strained despite his continued attempts to maintain an appearance of calm authority. "This is preposterous. These documents could easily have been fabricated by anyone seeking to discredit me. This woman was dismissed from palace service under suspicious circumstances herself. Why should this council trust her word or accept documents supposedly recovered through what amounts to nothing more than common theft?" "A fair question," the Queen replied calmly, "which is why I have also brought forward corroborating testimony." She nodded toward the chamber's side entrance, and Elara watched with surprise as Master Ellery Combe entered, looking nervous but resolute as he approached the council's central table. "I did not know the full truth of Miss Foley's, or rather Miss Whitmore's, purpose within my office," Master Combe said, addressing the council directly. but I can confirm that Lord Grey's steward came asking pointed questions about new staff members shortly before this council session was moved forward unexpectedly. Such behavior seemed unusual enough that I felt it worth mentioning, should it prove relevant to Her Majesty's concerns. Another council member, an older woman Alara did not recognize, spoke up from her seat. I have also noticed unusual activity in recent weeks, quiet conversations among certain staff members that ceased abruptly whenever I approached. I confess I did not think much of it at the time, but hearing this account now, I wonder if I too witnessed small pieces of this same conspiracy, without fully understanding their significance. The tide within the chamber began shifting visibly as more voices joined in, confirming small, seemingly unconnected observations that now, taken together, painted an increasingly damning picture of the conspiracy the Queen had described. Lord Grey's expression grew darker with each passing testimony, his earlier composed denials giving way to visible frustration, as he realized the careful narrative he had likely prepared was collapsing under the weight of accumulated evidence. Lady Sinclair, who had remained largely silent throughout the proceedings, finally spoke, her voice trembling slightly despite an obvious attempt to maintain dignity. Whatever occurred, I acted only under Lord Grey's direction. I believed we were correcting genuine failures in governance, not committing treason against the crown. Her words, whether intended as a defense or simply a desperate attempt to shift blame, only served to further confirm the conspiracy's existence before the assembled council. Lord Grey shot her a look of pure fury, though he said nothing further, apparently recognizing that any additional denial would only appear increasingly hollow given the mounting evidence against him. The Queen allowed a long moment of silence to settle over the chamber before speaking again, her voice carrying the full weight of royal authority. Given the evidence presented, and the corroborating testimony offered by multiple witnesses, I formally charge Lord Nathaniel Grey and Lady Beatrice Sinclair with conspiracy against the Crown, through the deliberate forgery of official documents intended to undermine legitimate governance. Guards, please escort them from this chamber and hold them for formal judgment according to the law. The guards stationed near the chamber's entrances moved forward immediately, flanking Lord Grey and Lady Sinclair before either could attempt any protest or resistance. Lord Grey's face had gone pale with the sudden realization of his complete downfall, his earlier confidence entirely stripped away, as guards guided him firmly toward the chamber's exit. Lady Sinclair, weeping quietly, offered no further resistance as she too was escorted from the room. A heavy silence followed their departure, the assembled council members exchanging glances that mixed relief with lingering shock at how close the conspiracy had come to succeeding. Several members rose from their seats, murmuring quietly among themselves about the implications of what had just transpired, the realization slowly settling over the chamber that a genuine attempt to seize power through deception had very nearly succeeded within their own halls. One elder statesman, a man with silver hair and a deeply lined face who had served on the council for longer than Alara had been alive, approached the platform to address the Queen directly. "Your Majesty, this council failed in its duty to protect the integrity of this government. We should have questioned Lord Grey's growing influence far sooner than we did. I offer my personal apology for this oversight, and my full support in whatever measures you deem necessary to restore proper order." The Queen accepted his words with a gracious nod. "No single council member bears responsibility for the deception of a determined conspirator, Lord Ashworth. What matters now is that we move forward with renewed vigilance, and with gratitude toward those who helped expose this threat before it could cause lasting harm to our kingdom." The Queen turned to address the chamber once more, her expression softening slightly as she looked toward Alara, still standing before the platform where the entire dramatic confrontation had unfolded. "This council owes a debt of gratitude to Alara Whitmore," the Queen said, "whose courage and loyalty prevented a grave injustice from being committed against this crown and this kingdom. Her willingness to return to danger, under a false identity, at great personal risk, exemplifies exactly the kind of character this council should hope to find among all who serve within these walls." A ripple of applause spread through the chamber, hesitant at first, then growing steadier as more council members joined in, acknowledging Alara's contribution. She stood somewhat overwhelmed by the sudden shift from fear and tension to open recognition, unable to fully process the abrupt resolution of weeks spent in careful, quiet danger. After the council session concluded and the chamber slowly emptied, the Queen invited Alara to join her in the private study where their earlier meetings had taken place, away from the formal atmosphere of the council chamber. Grace and Master Combe joined them briefly, offering their own quiet congratulations before excusing themselves to allow the Queen and Alara a private moment together. "I cannot fully express how grateful I am," the Queen said, once they were alone. her earlier formal composure giving way to something warmer and more personal. "You risked everything to help uncover this conspiracy, and you did so without hesitation, despite everything you had already suffered because of my choices. You did what you believed necessary to protect me," Alara replied. "I understand that now, completely, and I am grateful you trusted me enough to bring me back, to give me the chance to help set things right." The queen smiled, a genuine, unguarded expression Alara had rarely seen during her years of formal service. "I would like to offer you a permanent position here, not as a seamstress, though you are welcome to continue that work if you wish, but as a trusted advisor within my own household, someone whose judgment and loyalty I have now seen tested under the most difficult circumstances imaginable." Alara felt tears forming, unexpected and overwhelming, as the full weight of everything she had endured finally began to settle into something resembling peace. "I would be honored, Your Majesty." "Please," the queen said softly, reaching out to take Alara's hand once more. "After everything we have been through together, I think it is time you called me by my given name, at least when we are alone. My name is Eleanor." "Eleanor," Alara repeated, testing the unfamiliar intimacy of the name, feeling the weight of formal distance between them finally beginning to dissolve into something closer to genuine friendship. They sat together in comfortable silence for a long moment, the danger and uncertainty of recent weeks finally beginning to fade into memory. Outside the study's window, the first light of a new morning was beginning to spread gently across the palace grounds, illuminating a future that felt, for the first time in a very long while, genuinely hopeful. In the days that followed, word of Lord Grey's conspiracy and its dramatic exposure spread quickly throughout the kingdom, and Alara found herself regarded with a mixture of curiosity and respect by staff who had once known her only as a quiet seamstress. She returned briefly to her aunt's village to share the full story, watching Margaret's face shift from worried anticipation to overwhelming relief and pride as she recounted everything that had happened since their tearful goodbye weeks earlier. She visited Oliver Bramwell as well, thanking him properly for his crucial help in decoding the hidden cipher that had first set her on this path toward the truth. The old scholar seemed quietly pleased by the outcome, though characteristically modest about his own role in uncovering the conspiracy. "You would have found your way to the truth eventually, with or without my help," Oliver told her, waving off her gratitude with a small, knowing smile. "Some people simply possess the kind of determination that refuses to accept unanswered questions. I merely gave you a small push in the right direction." She also sought out Henry Dalton on his next visit to the village, finding him unloading bolts of fabric from his cart in the market square, much as he had been during their first conversation weeks earlier. His eyebrows rose with surprise and genuine delight when she explained everything that had happened since their brief exchange about court tensions and Lady Sinclair's ambitions. "I only meant to share a bit of harmless gossip," Henry admitted, shaking his head with quiet amazement. "I never imagined it might set off something of this scale. I am glad to see it ended well for you, Alara, truly glad." Back at the palace, Alara found herself settling gradually into her new position within the Queen's household, a role that carried none of the rigid formality of her earlier service as a seamstress, yet demanded an entirely different kind of careful attention. She began attending select meetings alongside Eleanor, offering perspective on matters affecting the household staff and the broader palace community, her unique understanding of both noble and common life proving valuable in ways neither of them had fully anticipated. Grace, who had guided her so carefully through the dangerous weeks of her return, became a close friend during this period, the two women often sharing quiet meals together, as Grace explained more about her own long history of discreet service to the crown, work that had rarely been acknowledged publicly, despite its critical importance to the kingdom's stability. Master Ellery Combe, upon learning the full truth of Marianne Foley's true identity and purpose, expressed no resentment at having been deceived, only quiet pride at having unknowingly played a small part in exposing the conspiracy. "I always suspected there was more to you than a simple clerk's background," he told her with a warm smile during a chance meeting in the palace corridors. "I am glad to have been of some help, even without fully understanding the stakes at the time." When Alara finally returned to the palace to begin her new role within the Queen's household, she felt a profound sense of belonging she had never quite experienced during her earlier years of service. The quiet seamstress who had once been ordered to leave the palace before dawn had returned not merely as a trusted servant, but as a confidant and friend to the crown, her loyalty and courage forever woven into the story of a kingdom she had helped protect from betrayal within its own walls. 3 months passed following the dramatic council session that exposed Lord Grey and Lady Sinclair's conspiracy, and the palace gradually settled into a steadier rhythm, though the memory of those tense weeks remained fresh in the minds of everyone who had witnessed the confrontation. Lord Grey and Lady Sinclair faced formal judgment before the Crown's appointed magistrates, stripped of their titles and estates, their fall from power serving as a stark warning to any other nobles who might have considered similar schemes against the throne. Ilara settled fully into her new role within Eleanor's household, finding that the transition from quiet seamstress to trusted advisor came with challenges she had not fully anticipated. She spent long hours learning the intricate details of palace administration, court etiquette among the remaining nobility, and the delicate balance of diplomacy required when navigating conversations with council members who still harbored quiet uncertainty about a common seamstress rising so suddenly to a position of influence. Not everyone within the palace welcomed her new status with open enthusiasm. A handful of nobles, though careful never to voice their objections directly to the queen, made their disapproval known through subtle slights and cold formality whenever Ilara attended official functions on Eleanor's behalf. She found herself navigating these tensions with the same careful patience she had once applied to delicate needlework, understanding that trust and acceptance, much like a finely stitched gown, could not be rushed without risking the entire fabric unraveling. One afternoon, several weeks after settling into her new duties, Ilara encountered Lady Constance Ashby, formerly known simply as Constance, the attendant whose careful movements around the archive room had nearly led to Ilara's discovery during that tense night of investigation. Following the exposure of the conspiracy, Constance had come forward voluntarily, revealing that she had been coerced into assisting Lord Grey's scheme through threats against her family, information that had ultimately spared her from the harshest judgment faced by the conspiracy's primary architects. "I owe you an apology," Constance said quietly, approaching Ilara in a quiet palace garden where she had gone to enjoy a rare moment of solitude. "I nearly discovered you that night in the archive room. If I had, everything might have ended very differently." "You did not know the truth of what you were caught up in," Ilara replied gently, understanding all too well how easily circumstances beyond one's control could shape difficult choices. "I am glad you found the courage to come forward afterward, even knowing the risk it carried." The two women spoke for a long while that afternoon, an unexpected friendship beginning to form between them, despite their very different roles in the events that had unfolded. Constance, now working in a modest administrative position within the palace, expressed quiet gratitude at having been given a chance to rebuild her reputation, rather than facing complete ruin alongside those who had manipulated her into assisting their conspiracy. Ilara also maintained her close friendship with Grace, whose years of discreet service continued to prove invaluable, as Ilara learned the more subtle, unofficial workings of palace life that no formal training could fully teach. Grace often shared stories of previous crises the Crown had quietly navigated over the years, offering Ilara perspective on how deeply the challenges she had faced fit into a much longer history of careful, hidden work required to protect the stability of the kingdom. Master Ellery Combe, meanwhile, found himself unexpectedly promoted to oversee a broader division of palace administration, a recognition of his steady, careful management of the record-keeping office during the tense weeks when Ilara had worked quietly within his staff under a false identity. He remained genuinely fond of Ilara, often stopping to share updates about the office's daily happenings whenever their paths crossed within the palace corridors. Oliver Bramwell, too, found his quiet life touched by the aftermath of the conspiracy's exposure. Word of his skill in decoding old ciphers eventually reached the palace scholars, who invited him to consult occasionally on matters requiring his particular expertise. Though he remained content in his small cottage at the edge of the village, he took evident pride in these occasional requests for his knowledge, and Ilara made a point of visiting him whenever her duties brought her near the village, always grateful for the steady, thoughtful guidance he had offered during the most uncertain days of her investigation. Henry Dalton, the traveling merchant whose casual conversation in the market square had first set Ilara on the path toward uncovering the conspiracy, found his fabric business flourishing in the months that followed, as word spread quietly through certain circles that he had played a small, unwitting part in protecting the crown. He never sought recognition for his role, preferring instead the simple satisfaction of knowing he had helped in his own modest way, and he continued his regular visits to the village, always greeting Ilara warmly whenever their paths crossed during her visits to see her aunt. Ilara returned to visit her Aunt Margaret regularly during this period, the two of them growing closer than ever as Margaret listened with pride to stories of Ilara's new responsibilities and the steady trust she continued building within Eleanor's inner circle. On one such visit, Margaret gently raised a question that had clearly been on her mind for some time. "Are you happy, truly happy with this new life you have built?" she asked, studying Ilara carefully across the familiar kitchen table, where so many of their earlier conversations about the conspiracy had taken place. Ilara considered the question thoughtfully before answering. It is not the life I imagined for myself. Certainly not when I first arrived at the palace gates as a nervous young girl all those years ago. But yes, I believe I am happy. I have found purpose in this work, and I have earned Eleanor's trust and friendship through means I never expected. I would not trade that, even knowing everything I endured to reach this point. Margaret smiled, satisfied by the genuine conviction in Alara's answer. Then I am happy for you, truly. Your mother would have been so proud, watching you find such strength and courage within yourself. Back at the palace, Eleanor continued relying heavily on Alara's counsel as the kingdom worked to fully recover from the disruption caused by Lord Grey's conspiracy. New council members were appointed to fill the vacancies left by his and Lady Sinclair's removal, and Eleanor made a point of including voices from beyond the traditional noble families, believing that broader perspectives might help prevent similar conspiracies from taking root so easily in the future. I have been thinking, Eleanor said one quiet evening, as she and Alara reviewed a stack of correspondence together, in the private study that had become a familiar setting for so many of their important conversations, about creating a more permanent position dedicated to protecting the kingdom against exactly this kind of hidden threat, someone who understands both the formal workings of court and the quieter, more subtle currents of loyalty and betrayal that often escape official notice. Do you have someone in mind for such a role? Alara asked, though something in Eleanor's careful tone suggested she already suspected the answer. Eleanor smiled warmly. I believe I already do. Someone who has proven, beyond any doubt, that she possesses exactly the courage, discretion, and loyalty such a position would require. Alara felt a familiar mixture of surprise and quiet pride at the suggestion, understanding fully the significance of what Eleanor was proposing. I would be honored to take on such a responsibility, if you believe I am ready for it. I have no doubt whatsoever, Eleanor replied. You have already proven yourself capable of far more than most who have served this crown for many years longer than you. In the months that followed, Alara's new role gradually took shape, blending her established position as Eleanor's trusted advisor with a quieter, more specialized responsibility for identifying and addressing potential threats to the kingdom's stability before they could grow into full conspiracies. She worked closely with Grace, whose own long experience in discreet service provided invaluable guidance as Alara learned the careful, patient work of protecting a kingdom from dangers that rarely announced themselves openly. She thought often, during this period of transition, about the frightened young woman who had once been marched out of the palace gates before dawn, uncertain why her world had so suddenly collapsed around her. That painful morning, once the source of such confusion and heartbreak, had ultimately led her toward a purpose and place within the kingdom she could never have imagined for herself during her quiet years as a simple seamstress. On the anniversary of that fateful morning, Eleanor invited Alara to join her once more in the same private study where their partnership had truly begun to take shape during those dangerous weeks of investigation. Eleanor poured 2 cups of tea, setting them carefully on the small table between them, before speaking with quiet reflection. A year ago today, I made one of the most difficult decisions of my reign, sending away someone I trusted deeply, without any explanation, simply to keep her safe from dangers I could not yet fully expose. I have often wondered whether there might have been a better way to protect you, one that would have spared you so much pain and confusion. Alara reached across the table, gently taking Eleanor's hand in her own. Perhaps there was a better way, and perhaps there was not. But I do not regret the path that brought us here, difficult as it was. Every part of that painful morning, every fearful night since, led directly to the trust and friendship we now share, and to the purpose I have found within these walls. I would not trade that outcome, whatever alternative path might have existed instead. Eleanor squeezed her hand warmly, her eyes bright with genuine affection and gratitude. Then let us look forward, together, toward whatever challenges this kingdom faces next, confident in the strength of the partnership we have built through everything we endured to reach this point. Outside the study window, the palace grounds stretched peacefully beneath a clear evening sky, the quiet stability of the kingdom now firmly restored after the turbulence of recent months. Alara sat with Eleanor in comfortable silence, 2 women bound together not merely by royal duty, but by a friendship forged through genuine trust, shared danger, and an unwavering commitment to protecting something they both believed deeply worth protecting. As the evening deepened into night, Alara found herself reflecting on how far she had traveled since that frightened walk home along the frost-covered road, certain her life at the palace had ended forever in disgrace. She thought of every person who had helped her along the way, her aunt's steady comfort, Oliver's careful expertise, Henry's casual but crucial warning, Grace's patient guidance, and Eleanor's unwavering trust. each one a thread woven into the larger fabric of the life she had ultimately built for herself within these walls. Whatever challenges awaited her in the years ahead, Elara understood clearly now that she would face them not as an outsider looking in, but as a trusted and permanent part of the kingdom she had once feared she had lost forever on that dark, uncertain morning before dawn.